Just a little housekeeping before we get started. All attendees' mics are muted and have been disabled. We will be taking any questions and comments after the presentation. You can also write any questions in the chat as we're going, and they will be read aloud at the end. We'll give the attendees an opportunity to unmute themselves at that time to also ask any questions live in the meeting. So at this time, I'll introduce our team. I am Latoya F. I am a project manager with the Office of Customer and Community Relations with MDOT MTA. We have Joseph Calhoun, who is our Title VI and ADA coordinator with the Office of Equal Opportunity and Compliance. Jeremy Strauss, who is a senior transportation planner with a consultant agency with MDOT MTA. And Kyle Davis, who is the Chief of Service Planning with MDOT MTA's Office of Service Development. I will turn it over to Joe Calhoun, who will do our presentation for this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. So before we get into the specifics of MTA's Title VI program and our major service change policy, I thought it'd be helpful just to explain some of the terms and the background. We often refer to Title VI, and people may not necessarily know what we're referencing. Folks in the transit industry have a habit of using acronyms and technical terms and just different industry jargon. And it's important that we make sure that everyone understands what we're saying so that they can have a full appreciation of the policies that we're discussing and the impacts that they have. So when people in the transit industry refer to Title VI or any Title VI requirements, we're referencing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark piece of legislation originally proposed by President Kennedy and signed into law July 2nd, 1964 by President Johnson. This was considered to be one of the crowning achievements of the civil rights movement. While it didn't achieve everything that folks had hoped it would, it brought forward a lot of progress. It was a big step forward. So what did it entail? Well, the Civil Rights Act was a civil rights and labor law that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, depending on which chapter of the law it was referencing. Each chapter applied differently to different classifications and different groups of people. It prohibited unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodations. So the law was divided into what they called titles, which essentially just means chapters or sections. The first chapter dealt with voting rights. The second one was public accommodations, then desegregation of public facilities, desegregation of public education. It created a Commission on Civil Rights. And then in Chapter 6, in Title 6, was the portion of the law that dealt with non-discrimination in federally assisted programs. So the majority, if not all, of transit agencies across the country receive federal assistance, be it either financial funding or technical assistance, either of which then makes the requirements of Title VI apply to that agency. And Title VI specifically dealt with race, color, and national origin. So some of the other classifications that other chapters in the law had don't necessarily apply here at Title VI. So for us, the requirement was that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, which, as I noted, MTA receives federal financial assistance. The law also had other elements in the realm of equal employment opportunity, voter registration information, community relations service, and other provisions. But for us, we are focused on Chapter 6, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which applied to race, color, and national origin. Well, what did that chapter have in it? What are the requirements, right? So the FTA, which is the Federal Transit Administration, so that's the federal governmental organization that regulates and oversees transit agencies across the country, has some requirements for transit agency. And one of them is that we have to provide assurances, written assurances annually, where our authorizing official signs that we are compliant with the requirements of Title VI. We're also required to prepare and submit a Title VI program every 3 years to the Federal Transit Administration. And that could change. Right now it's every 3 years. For equal employment opportunity, for example, another area where we have to have a program that we submit to the FTA, it used to be every 3 years and then it changed to every 4 years. But currently, MTA updates its program every 3 years in accordance with federal regulations. Our most recent program is available on our website. It was updated in May of 2020, and it's available on our website if you would like to check it out. And the next time we are due to submit one would be June of 2023. We will be updating by then as well. We're required to notify riders of their protections under Title VI. So that is something you might see on our buses or at our metro stations across the agency. On our website, you will see Title VI notice. So when you see that term Title VI notice, what it's really saying is civil rights notice. We're letting you know your civil rights that you have as a rider or a beneficiary of MTA services. And we do have those on our vehicles in both English and Spanish on our buses and at our metro stations and elsewhere throughout the system. We're required to develop Title VI compliance procedures in a complaint form. So if someone feels like they've been discriminated against, whether individually or as a member of a group collectively on the grounds of race, color, or national origin, they would be able to file a complaint to MTA. And that complaint form is on our website on our Title VI page. When those occur, transit agencies are required to record them, keep a document list of them, and report them. Any Title VI related complaints, investigations, and lawsuits we're required to report to the Federal Transit Administration every 3 years when we submit our program. We're required to promote inclusive public participation. Our Title VI program has a public participation plan in it, which you can find on our website. We're required to provide meaningful access to LEP persons. So what does that mean? So that's limited English proficiency individuals, people who have a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English, for whom English is not their primary language. So in the greater MTA service area, which is quite large, all of our services across the state, we have a roughly 3.5% of our service area are individuals for whom Spanish is their primary language, and they have a limited ability to read, write, or speak or understand English. And that's something we've determined from census data. So because of that, we translate our vital documents, the documents that we are deemed to be most important to accessing our services, into Spanish automatically. And most of those are already available on our website or in print. And then we also have other tools that we provide for additional languages. So we have tear sheets that we give that can have information on how to get help. We have a language line that has live translation of our website, a variety of tools that we use to ensure that we have meaningful access for limited English proficiency individuals. Transit agencies are also required to report the minority representation of any planning bodies and advisory groups that they have and encourage participation of minorities in those committees. So MTA has 3 advisory committees: the Citizens Advisory Committee, our Citizens Advisory Committee on Accessible Transportation, and our MARC Riders Advisory Council. So we do report the demographics of those to the Federal Transit Administration every 3 years when we update our program, and we strive to have a membership of those committees that is reflective of the diverse nature of our service area. And if anyone is interested in participating in those committees, information is on our website. We are also required to provide assistance to any subrecipients that we have. MTA has roughly 100 subrecipients who receive funding from MTA, and there are locally operated transit systems across the state, about 22 of those, as well as other nonprofits that receive funding for transportation services they provide. So we help them with their Title VI requirements and their programs in other realms. We provide planning assistance and other types of technical assistance to them. We do monitor those subrecipients. We review their Title VI programs to see that they're compliant and review their other civil rights programs as well. In addition, certain types of facilities, when a transit agency has constructed them, primarily they're specific types of maintenance facilities. We're required to do a equity analysis when we construct those to make sure that we are not having any disparate impact on minority populations or disproportionate burden for low-income populations. There are other analyses that occur under National Environmental Policy Act and environmental justice procedures that cover other types of facilities, but there's a certain subgroup for which there are formal Title VI requirements. Also, we are required to develop system-wide service standards and system-wide service policies. Those can be found in our Title VI program, and we monitor those on an ongoing basis. Now, these last 4 items that are in bold, you may be thinking that your local transit system, perhaps if you live in Frederick or Anne Arundel County or Ocean City, whatever you may be, if you're joining us from other parts of the state, you may be thinking, oh, well, my transit agency doesn't do these. Are they in violation of their civil rights requirements under Title VI? And these ones in bold are only for large transit agencies. So that would be transit agencies that have at least 50 vehicles, 50 transit vehicles in operation during their peak service at any given time. And they have a service area that exceeds 200,000 individuals for the area in which they operate. So not every transit agency has these requirements, but MTA does because we are a large transit agency. We exceed 50 vehicles in operation at the same time, and there are more than 200,000 people in our service area. So we are required to conduct a demographic analysis of our service area for which we provide service. And that is something we do at a minimum of every 3 years when we update our program, and it's included in our Title VI program, which is updated every 3 years. We are also required to collect data regarding the customer demographics and travel patterns. So that can be something tough to ascertain, one's travel patterns, right? That is something that we have to do a survey in order to obtain that information. And we use the most recently available survey data when we update our program. So if you are ever on our services and you see that we're conducting origin and destination surveys, is what we call them, where one boards and where one gets off the vehicle, that's how we're able to ascertain the travel patterns of our riders and the different groups of riders by demographics. So that helps us to make sure that there are no disparate impacts in any service changes that we conduct or any fare changes. We are also required to monitor our standards and policies and report any results and actions taken to adjust if we find any disparities. So that is something that is done at a minimum of every 3 years when we update our program, and the results of the 2020 monitoring can be found in our Title VI program on our website. But we also monitor on an ongoing basis. We have various dashboards that we're keeping an eye on things to strive to always be equitable and make sure that things don't wait 3 years before fixing any disparities that may exist. And then finally, we're required to evaluate service and fare changes for equity impacts. So that is where we're focusing today. Our major service change policy is an element of such. So you may be thinking, why would you have to evaluate these service changes, and when do you do it, and how often do you do it? So the why. So you may be thinking no government body would intentionally discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin, or but well-intentioned service changes could result in unintentional discrimination. You could have a route that has declining ridership. And despite the planning department and service development department's best efforts to adjust that route to boost ridership, they may switch to times, improve the reliability of it, check the running times, maybe extend service. They might deviate it to add a school or hospital or something so that it has more generation of riders on it. The ridership continued to decline for whatever reason. Well, that route may then have service cut. And we need to make sure that when we're cutting service, particularly if we're having a substantial cut in service, that there is no disparate impact to minority populations or low-income populations. And the same would be true in reverse. We might have a route that is doing really well, that perhaps serves a distribution center or warehouses, which is a really growing sector of the economy, a lot of e-commerce, right? Well, if we keep on adding service on that route, we need to make sure that we are not disproportionately benefiting non-minority and non-low-income populations, because that could come at the cost of service not being added elsewhere or potentially service being cut elsewhere, depending on what resources we have. So that is why we need to evaluate these service changes. The law within Title VI covers both discriminatory intent and discriminatory impact. So we do these to determine whether service or fare changes will result in a disparate impact upon minority riders or a disproportionate burden upon low-income riders. But before conducting a service equity analysis, we need to have procedures in place and a policy. So the very first thing is we need to have a major service change policy, which is what our focus will be today. That determines when you conduct an equity analysis. And not every service change has it, but major changes do. We have to define the adverse effects that come from major service changes or fare changes. We have to establish a disparate impact policy and a disproportionate burden policy. So MTA has established both of those. They are available on our website. They were most recently updated last year in 2020 when we were updating our Title VI program. And our disparate impact and disproportionate burden policies are 10%. So if there's a difference of 10% between minority populations and non-minority populations, or low-income populations and non-low-income populations, that is a disparate impact between who is experiencing that burden or who's experiencing that benefit. And then we have to validate the data sets that we will use. So there are two types of data sets that we use with our equity analyses. One would be census data, which we would use the most recently available, which is typically through the American Community Survey, ACS, they refer to it. And that's something that the Census Bureau conducts on an ongoing basis, even between censuses. So we use the most recent reliable data that we have from the census. And we also have our survey data, which we referenced earlier, which is specific to our riders. So we use those two things, those two data sets, depending on which type of analysis we're using. But what is a major service change, right? I said we need to create a major service change policy. Why do we have this? What is its role? So the major service change policy triggers service equity analyses, as I noted before. Only service changes that rise to the level of the thresholds established in our major service change policy must be analyzed via the formal Title VI service equity analyses. It's important to note that MTA incorporates equity throughout the service development process, from the beginning when we're having ideas of changes to routes, when we're reviewing various alternatives, and all the stages, including and up to when we go to the public proposal and we weigh the options with the public. But the formal Title VI equity analysis process is something that's very specific, very regimented, where you need the final data of how the route's going to be, the actual numbers of revenue hours and revenue miles, which that data is not available until things are fully planned out. So we have equity throughout the whole process as a consideration. It's central to our service planning process, but this requirement, this analysis is very specific, and it follows procedures that are dictated by the Federal Transit Administration. So also, it's worth noting that our service equity analyses, this formal Title VI document, they are reviewed and considered and ideally ultimately approved by the administrator. If the administrator rejects it because they have some concerns, then we have to go back to the drawing board. But it's important to know that if there is this major service change, it's something that triggers this threshold that we exceed the limits of what is considered major, then it's engaged throughout the whole agency. So it's not just the Service Development Office, but also the Equal Opportunities Compliance Programs Office reviews that document, and the administrator reviews it as well. So there's lots of eyes on this to make sure that the equity, that there's equity in these major changes. It's also important to note that major service changes include both increases and decreases in service. It's not just if you're reducing service or cutting a route, it includes adding a route or increasing service. And it includes various types of changes to the service. So it's service availability, the span of service, the frequency of service, and the geographic alignment and routing of a bus route or a rail line. And we'll talk about those terms on the next slide. Also, these policies are unique to each mode. So our rail modes may have different characteristics than our bus modes. Rail files fixed guideway, it can only go down a certain line. It can't necessarily change to where there's not rail tracks. And it can only stop where there's established stations. And those stations don't change frequently. It'd be quite major if you were to either remove or add a station. Those are quite expensive to construct. So they have a policy that's different than our bus modes because they have different characteristics. And also, finally, MTA's major service change policy is reviewed every 3 years when we update our program, but we are able to update it in between programs if conditions warrant such. And that is part of why we are reaching out to the public today, because we have learned some lessons through the pandemic. We've interfaced with our peers. We've picked up some industry best practices and collectively, the transit industry has learned some lessons throughout the last 2 years that we think we would like to incorporate into our major service change policy, and we're reaching out to the public for their feedback. We are required to do public outreach when we update this policy, and this is the third of 3 virtual meetings that we've had sharing these changes with the public. But it's important to note that we had meetings prior to such. So we met with our Citizens Advisory Committee, and we shared our proposed changes with them and gathered their feedback. We met with our Citizens Advisory Committee on Accessible Transportation, and we met with our Marked Riders Advisory Council. And there was a 4th meeting. There is a subcommittee, a specific committee that deals with Title VI and mobility concerns. And it's a subcommittee of both CAC, the Citizen Advisory Committee, and the Citizen Advisory Committee on Accessible Transportation. So those 2 bodies work together for a subcommittee that focuses on Title VI and mobility. And we met with them as well and shared this to get their feedback for a more in-depth, deeper dive into the proposed changes. So I mentioned a couple technical terms in the last slide, and before we review the current policies and what the proposed changes are, we should review these just so that you have a full understanding of what we're referencing when we talk about the thresholds, right? So we use the term service day throughout our policies. That refers to the level of service being operated. So it's not necessarily Wednesday, September 22nd, or a Tuesday or whatever. It's not referring to the day of the week or a specific date. It's referring to the level of service. And MTA has 3 primary levels of service. We have weekday service, where the routes would operate the same service Monday through Friday. We have Saturday service, where routes may then have a different level of service on Saturdays because schools may be out or offices may be closed, so that there's a different frequency or span of service on a route. And then we have Sunday service, which may be different still because Sundays have different needs for riders and travel patterns than Saturdays and weekdays. So when we say service day, we're talking about the level of service, weekday service, for example. Span of service, I've used that term a couple times now. That refers on a given day, on a given service day, the level of service from the time of the start of the very first revenue trip for that route through the end of the final revenue trip for that route. So you may have a route that starts at 6 a.m., picking up people at the beginning of the route, and it runs through and it reaches the end of the line on this last trip at 11:30 p.m. That would be the span of service, 6 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. Now, obviously, some of our routes operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that would be the whole day. We measure that within the span on revenue hours. So that would be the number of hours that a transit vehicle spends in revenue service, including the time picking up and dropping off passengers and operator layover time while in service. It does not include the time that a vehicle spends with its doors closed, out of service, just commuting to the start of a trip, or when the trips are over and it's done for the day, going back to the garage. That period that we call deadheading, a technical term in the transit industry, that's not included, nor does it include any type of operator training that's going on or maintenance testing where they might be taking a vehicle out on the road just to make sure equipment's working. It's only when the vehicle is in operation and service to the public, where we were picking up and dropping off people. That would be the revenue hours. And revenue miles would be the same type of concept, but it applies to the miles that the vehicle passes while in service as opposed to the hours. We use the term stop at a station. I mentioned how rail modes have a different characteristic than our bus modes because rail may not stop at every station on every trip. It may start partway on a line, or it may only go 3/4 of the length down the line. For example, on the Penn line, some of the trips only go as far as Baltimore. They don't go further north. So we need to measure that, because if we change the number of stops at a station, that could be substantial. That could have a big impact for people who live near that station. Whereas bus doesn't have that nature. You know, it typically starts at the beginning of the route and goes to the end of the route, unless it's an express route, which those are labeled as such. And then our core bus system. So we break our policies down specific to mode, and one of the modes is our core bus mode. But we want to make sure that everyone knows what we're referring to with that. For folks who've been using and riding MTA services for a few years now, you're familiar with perhaps the Baltimore Link system redesign, where this term may be used widely. And In that, we shared the term core bus and what entails. So it's the city link routes, the local link routes, and the express bus link routes. Collectively, those three types of bus routes are our core bus system. And it's roughly 65, maybe 64 something bus routes. Those are what we're referring to. So it doesn't include commuter bus and it doesn't include the rail modes. It's just those routes. And then service year, that's the final technical term, although it may not seem so technical, that we use in the program, but we want to make sure everyone's on the same page. And that refers to 1 calendar year, equal to 365 or 366 days. And that will come up in some of the new elements of our policies that we're proposing. So with that, let's look at our current policy for our core bus system and what our proposals are for adding to that policy. So our current policy for core bus for major service changes would be an alteration of a route's revenue miles or revenue hours on a given service day by 25% or more, including establishment or abandonment of a route, which obviously if we're establishing a new route, that's 100% change. If we're abandoning a route, that's 100% change. But 25%, so for example, the local link 22, and not that we have any plans for changing its service, but as a hypothetical, if we were to increase service on that, let's say it currently operates every 10 to 15 minutes and we say, you know, it's great, it has a lot of riders, let's have it operate every 2 to 5 minutes. That would be more than a 25% change in the level of service, the number of hours and miles that route is operating. That is something that would be a major change. Or in reverse, if we had a route that we were reducing service, let's say the local link 82. And again, I'm not aware of any plans for changing this route, but it's just a hypothetical. If for whatever reason we said, you know, there's not a lot of riders on this and the bus is going around and it's mostly empty, we think, you know, due to some planning that we did, that we can reduce this service. And if we pick these times and these trips, it'll be more efficient in serving the riders who need it for the times that they need to get places. Maybe it's based off the shifts at a given hospital or shopping center or something like that, which that the route serves. And if we were to say it currently operates every 20 minutes, but we think we don't need that and we're going to have it drop down to every 40 minutes, that would be a major change. So that's what we're talking about with a 25% or more change. A change to the span of service on a route by 90 minutes or more on a given service day. That is from the beginning of service for the day to the end of service today. So when I gave an example earlier, I mentioned a route, let's say that starts at 6 a.m. And I said it ended at, I believe I said 11:30 p.m. Well, if we change this to say it starts at 6 a.m., but it ends at 10 p.m., because, you know, at the end of the day, there's not a lot of riders on that route. We don't think we need to have that last trip. It's inefficient, and we can use those resources and put those buses on a different route, which is crowded. That would be a major change. If you were a rider of that route, you may not be able to get home from work or from night classes, from school, or whatever it may be. That would be a major change, and that would then have to have an equity analysis conducted to make sure that we're not disproportionately burdening low-income or minority populations, or in reverse. You know, we may have a route that's doing really well and the first couple trips of the morning are really crowded, or people say they can't get to work on time in surveys, or places that the route serves are contacting us saying, hey, you know, we have extra shifts in the morning that just people can't make it to work and are having to take taxis or something to work. We decided to extend service earlier, let's say. So instead of 6 a.m., the route would start at 4:30 a.m. Well, that would be more than a 90-minute change in the span of service that route operates. And that would be something that would be a major change. It has a big impact. It's a significant change in service operated, resources allocated there. And we would need to evaluate that to make sure that there's no equity impacts, that we're not disproportionately benefiting non-minority populations and non-low income populations. So those two elements of our core bus major service change policy are remaining the same. However, we are proposing some new additional elements, and these are ideas that we've received in conferring with our peers, observing the real life examples that transit agencies across the country have experienced over the last 18 months, and experiences here in the Baltimore area. The first one is alteration of a route's revenue miles or revenue hours on a given service day by a cumulative of 25% or more over the course of one service year. So in this scenario, we may not have changed the route by 25% in a given service change. Let's say the City Link yellow, it's doing really well, it's really crowded, we want to add more service, and we increase service by 10% in January. And it's still doing really well and has full buses, and it's soaking up all the buses that we give to it. It's like a sponge absorbing all the service we're giving to it, and it needs more service. And we add 10% again in June. Now we're at 20% change in only a few months, still under that 25%. But then September, we add another 10% because the route's just doing great. Whatever it is, there's new developments, new warehouses, new schools, new hospitals, whatever it is. Lots of riders attracted to that route. We've now changed service by 30% over the course of 1 year. In less than a year, we've changed service by 30%. That to us is major. We think that that's something that a lot of resources have been allocated to that route, and we want to make sure we're equitable in how we are providing service throughout the agency. None of those changes under our current policy that we just discussed would have triggered a major service change because it was 10% and then 10% and then 10% again. But collectively, 30% in less than a year is something that we feel is major. And this is something that does happen with some transit agencies in the country, where changes might pile up. And in order to embody the spirit of the Civil Rights Act and these regulations within Title VI, we believe that this is something that is needed for equity purposes. And the reverse would be true as well. If we were to cut service by 10% and then reduce service again by 10% and reduce it again by 10%, that's a 30% change in less than a year, even though none of those changes individually exceeded 25%. We think that that's something that should be reviewed for equity impacts to make sure that we are not disproportionately burdening minority populations or low-income populations, or in reverse, disproportionately benefiting non-minority and non-low-income populations. We want to make sure that we review those types of changes. The second new element that we are proposing in this policy would be the addition or removal of at least 15% of a route's bus stops on a given service day. So we don't have any plans for major changes to our bus stops at this time. As those who have been riding MTA services for a while know, that we underwent a significant system redesign a few years ago. And at that time, there were a lot of changes with the routes, and maybe some routes had bus stops removed. There's a process and a term in the transit industry called bus stop optimization. And that's where they review if bus is stopping too frequently. Every street is stopping, every block. That's pretty inefficient. And then it causes the route to take longer and less reliable service. So that may have occurred with the Baltimore Link, where we reviewed to make sure, okay, are we stopping too often? What's the optimal spacing between routes that's walkable for the public and accessible, but not inefficient? We're not planning that at this time, but if something like that did happen in the future, if a route had 15% of its bus stops removed or more, or 15% added, maybe due to public feedback, we decided to restore some of those bus stops maybe that were removed in the past. Well, if a route's changing its bus stops by 15% or more, that's gonna have big impacts to its riders on the running times and on the service availability, how far people have to walk to bus stops and things of that nature. That's major. That has a big impact on the riders of that route. And we think that is something that would have to be reviewed under the formal Title VI Service Equity Analysis process, because we think that's a major change. Then the last new element that we're proposing would be the cumulative alteration of at least 15% of the total core bus system revenue miles and revenue hours. So individually, no route is changing by 25%, not even over the course of the year. It's just one big change. Perhaps there is a massive transportation funding bill, and there's a bonanza of funding, and we're able to add a lot of service. We would love for such to happen. We would like to provide more service to the public if the funding and resources were available, right? So if that's happening, we need to make sure that we are reviewing it for equity impacts, because a 15% change of an entire mode, 15% change of core bus, there's the potential that there could be inequity in where service is being added. If some routes are increasing by 20% and others are only increasing by 10%, and it's a data-driven approach, based on ridership, that's fine, but we need to review to make sure that we're not having disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens for low income, or disparate impacts and disproportionate benefits, I should say, for non-minority and non-low income individuals. So if a non-minority route, a route that primarily serves non-minority populations, is increasing by 20%, while some of our minority focused routes that primarily serve minority populations and low income populations are only increasing by 10%, that's a big difference. So we would want to review that. Even though none of those are changing by 25%, there is a potential for disparity there. And we think that that is something that should undergo the formal Title VI service equity analysis process. Again, it is important to note that equity is an integral element of our service development process, and there are a variety of ways in which we review our proposals and service changes for equity impacts. But this Title VI process is very unique, and we want to make sure that when major changes happen, that Title VI process happens in accordance with federal guidelines. So those are the MARC changes, or those are the core bus changes. And now for MARC, we have a different policy, right? So we still have that 25% more, or revenue miles or revenue hours, and we have that 90-minute change of in the span of service. But we have a different third element currently in our MARC policy, and that is the change to the number of stops at a station on a given service day by 25% or more. So as I noted earlier, not every trip on MARC stops at every station, right? It may start partway through the line. And if they were to decide that additional trips would not stop at that station, and it ends up being a 25% change in the number of stops that are stopping at a station, perhaps Perryville, for example, that would be something that should be reviewed for equity impacts. If it's a 25% change in the number of stops at Perryville or Halethorpe or BWI, whatever it may be, if there's a 25% change in the number of stops at a given station, that could be a major change for the people who get on and off at that station, who utilize the services there. And we would want to review that. That's part of our policy, that we require ourselves to review that for Title VI service equity analysis. The other one is the establishment or abandonment of a station. That's the final element of our current MARC major service change policy. Removing a station would have a major impact for riders of MARC, because they could have to drive a very long distance to the next train station. That could essentially result in a total loss of service for them, because they may not be able to drive to the next station. That is something that's major. We don't have that in our core bus policy, because a single bus stop may not be a major change. People can just go another block or two to get to a bus stop, but the distance between stations for MARC is far further, and they're changed far less often. A station is a significant facility that is well established, whereas bus stops, we may have to change a single bus stop more often due to safety issues or property development. A property may be constructed and it's now no longer a new facility go up and it's no longer safe to stop there, or a new facility may go up and we add a bus stop. A single bus stop changing is not major, but a single train station changing is major. Those elements are not changing. We're keeping all those first four elements within our policy, but we are proposing to add that cumulative for the whole mode of 15%. So a cumulative alteration of at least 15% or more of the total MARC system revenue miles or revenue hours in a given service change. That is something that'd be major. MARC has three lines. It has the Penn line, the Brunswick line, and the Camden line. And if collectively those lines are changing in their total service by 15%, that's major. And we want to review it, because it's possible that the Brunswick line and the Camden line are getting 20% additional service. We've received extra funding and we're able to put more trips out there, whatever it may be, but the Penn line is only getting 10% additional service. Well, we want to make sure we review that. A 15% change, there could be that disparity there. And we would need to look at the demographics of those routes and who's impacted to see if there is a disparate impact or a disproportionate burden to low-income and low-income populations and minority populations, or if there's a disproportionate benefit to non-minority and non-low-income populations if that change is occurring. Commuter bus has a policy that is nearly identical to MARC. It has the 25% of revenue miles and revenue hours. That's staying the same. It has the 90 minutes on the change of the span of service. That also is staying the same. It has elimination of a stop unless there is another stop within 3 miles. So that's slightly different than Mark because it's easier to establish commuter bus stops. They tend to be at park and ride facilities. You don't have the tracks associated and all the infrastructure associated with rail. And if we were to get rid of a commuter bus stop where the bus would stop, but there's another one within 3 miles, because of the nature of their riders who tend to drive to the facility where they get on the commuter bus route, if there's another commuter bus stop on that route within 3 miles, it's not as major of an impact for the riders on that mode because they would be able to drive and it's only a couple minute difference to get to the other stop and then to continue on their route as they would ordinarily. The establishment of a new stop, though, is major. So that is part of our policy, and that also is not changing. The one new element for commuter bus would be the cumulative alteration of at least 15% of the total commuter bus system revenue miles or revenue hours in a given service change. That's similar to what we just discussed with Mark. It's identical to what we have added with, we're proposing to add with Mark and core bus system. So if collectively all of the commuter bus routes are changing by 15%, that's a pretty major change occurring to that system, to that mode. And we want to make sure that we review it under the formal Title VI Service Equity Analysis process to see if there's any disparate impacts or disproportionate burdens, because there could be degrees of difference in between the routes. Some routes receiving a lot of added service and other routes not, or some routes having a lot of cuts of service and other routes not, even though none of them are over that 25% threshold. There could be a big difference between them, and overall there's a big change. So that is something that we consider now to be major based on the lessons we've learned over the last 18 months and our consulting with our peers and industry best practices. Our Metro Subway Link policy has no proposed changes at this time. So it has the 25% of its revenue miles or revenue hours in its current policy, and we are not proposing changing that. It has the 90 minutes of change of span of service, which we're also not proposing changing. The change the number of stops at a given station by 25% or more, as you saw with the Mark policy, that is also in Metro Subway Link, and we're not proposing changing that. Metro has 14 stations, and maybe not every trip serves every station. That's why we have that. And then the establishment or abandonment of the station. If we were to drop out one of those stations for whatever reason, maybe there's some massive redevelopment and we lose our station for whatever reason. That's major. That limits the availability of service to individuals. Having to get to the next station is a long distance. That's a major change. We are keeping that. That's staying in our policy. We don't have any new elements, and we don't have that 15% mode wide because there's only one line on Metro Subway Link. So we wouldn't have to compare one subway line versus another subway line because there's only one subway line. So there are no changes at this time on that policy. Light Rail Link has a policy that's identical to Metro Subway Link, the 25% of revenue miles or revenue hours, the 90 minutes from the span of service, the 25% of the number of stops at a station on a given day, and the establishment or abandonment of a station. And we don't propose changing any of those at this time. Just like Metro, there's only one light rail line currently in the light rail link system. MTA only has one light rail line. Thus, we don't have that 15% light rail system collectively policy because there's only one line, and we want to be able to compare lines against each other. It is important to note that there are some exemptions to this policy. So the federal government in their regulations allows transit agencies to exempt certain service changes from receiving a formal Title VI service equity analysis. Again, as noted, we consider equity throughout our service development process, but this formal Title VI service equity analysis, which is a lengthy process, time consuming, it's not conducted for some changes because they are exempt. Transit agencies are not required to conduct a service equity analysis in these circumstances. So what are the scenarios where it happens? Seasonal service changes. Some bus routes in the core bus system, they increase service with our September, with our fall service change due to school resuming, and we know that we're going to have more riders on that route. The route's open to the public for all riders, whether they're students or not, but due to the students then riding the service, we may have that route operating more or added trips or whatever it may be to accommodate seasonal changes in ridership. And then come the summer, the June service change, we may then reduce service so we don't have buses driving around empty. That would be an inefficient use of state resources, right? That's a seasonal service change that happens every year. And although it is major, there may be more than a 25% change, or it could be 100% change for a given route. It doesn't receive that formal Title VI service equity analysis process because it's not a permanent change. We know that in June, when that service is taken away, it's coming back again in the fall. Or when we add service in the fall, we know it's not permanent. It's going to drop back down in June. And some of our locally operated transit systems, perhaps transit systems down near the shore, such as Ocean City, maybe they have the reverse. They have an influx of tourists in the summer, such that their buses become crowded and they need to add service. But then they know that come the fall, they may reduce service. Well, those aren't permanent changes, so you don't necessarily need to review them. It's something you do every year and it's just part of your natural service. So those don't receive Title VI service equity analyses. In addition, pilots. If we want to test something out, we're not sure it's going to work. Temporary creation or modification or discontinuation of a demonstration route, a pilot. If we were to end that within the first 12 months, that would not require a service equity analysis. It's important to note that there's various Code of Maryland state requirements for public engagement that do exist, but for pilot routes, we don't conduct the formal Title VI service equity analysis because it's, as I noted before, it's a lengthy, time-consuming, costly process. And if we were to have to conduct a Title VI service equity analysis for every pilot that we just want to test out, it could inhibit and prevent us from testing out service in new areas where the public may need it. Now, if that pilot lasts longer than 12 months, then we would need to conduct the service equity analysis. So when you're reaching that 12-month threshold, we would need to review it for equity because that's a new route and we want to make sure that we're not disproportionately benefiting non-minority populations and non-low income populations. So that's when the equity analysis would occur if it exceeds 12 months. In addition, there may be temporary diversions or frequency changes or span changes due to local events. You could have the Baltimore Marathon or a festival that streets are closed that prevent us from operating the route. Some of these may even last multiple days, right? You have festivals that are for a weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or longer. Construction, weather, different emergencies. Those scenarios do not require a Title VI service equity analysis, as long as they're temporary. And then finally, emergency service changes, including changes in the routes and service frequencies, which may be necessitated due to a disaster. Perhaps there's a tornado or a pandemic or something that is a natural disaster, a public health emergency that changes our access to public streets or our ability of our equipment to travel on public streets. Those emergency service changes, we can implement them immediately without a public hearing, provided that a finding identifying the circumstances under which the change is being taken is made. And then if it lasts longer than 12 months, we have to do that service equity analysis. So those exemptions are remaining the same. So do note that if something like that occurs in the future, that's why a service equity analysis doesn't occur. There is one thing that we want to clarify in this regard as far as exemptions is that in the rail mode, sometimes there are temporary changes to service due to planned or unplanned maintenance and inspections or repairs. There could be track work going on or things that affect the overhead catenary or the station availability. Maybe a station is being replaced, right? The concrete was in bad condition. They're upgrading it. They're making sure it's structurally sound and maybe even bringing it to have more accessibility features when a station's renovated. That could be a major change, but if it's temporary due to this planned construction, we know service is going to be restored once construction is done. That is exempt from the Title VI service equity analysis process. And then finally, for those who were listening closely or had sharp eyes, at the beginning of the slide, I said evaluate service and/or fare changes, and I talked about how we use our survey data for fare equity analyses. I mentioned the term fare a couple times, but I didn't mention a fair equity policy. You may be thinking, why doesn't MTA have a fair change policy in the way that we have a major service change policy? Maybe there's a major fair change. Well, the reason for that is that the FTA treats fair changes differently than service changes. Agencies are allowed to set their own major service change policies. That's what we've been told to do. The FTA doesn't even give us a sample one to use. They don't say, here's what we want you to use for major service change policy. They expect us to develop it based on our local conditions and the service we operate. But for fair changes, all fair changes must be evaluated under a fair equity analysis process, the formal Title VI process. It applies whether it's a fair increase or a fair decrease or a change in a fair, medium, or structure. So here in Maryland, under state law, we update our fares every 2 years on local service, every 5 years on our commuter service, in accordance with the consumer price index and the change in cost of living and things of that regard. There's lots of formulas that we're required to use under state law. And in recent history, typically the local service has increased 10 cents. And some folks may think, oh, 10 cents, that's not major. Under the FTA paradigm, the approach that they have, even a 10-cent change in service requires a fair equity analysis. And those are on our website if one wants to review them. In fact, even a penny change would necessitate a fair equity analysis under the FTA's guidelines. And that's why we don't have a fair change policy within the Title VI program. With that said, we've covered everything that we wanted to share with you today, and I turn things back over to LaToya.
Thank you, Joe. At this time, I will allow the ability for participants to unmute themselves to ask any questions or have any comments about the presentation you just heard. I noticed that people joined us a little late, so if you have any questions about things that you didn't hear, we are more than willing to answer those questions as well, or go back to any slides if you need to see those. But we will be here until 11 a.m. if anyone has any questions or comments based on the presentation. You can also feel free to place any of your questions or comments in the chat, and they will be read aloud for you. I do see a question here in the chat, and it's, are the suggested changes and change dates listed on the website? Jill, you're on mute.
So the presentation that we shared today, the PowerPoint that we went through, is on our website, and that is available for review, and we will welcome any feedback or comments, particularly if there are things that you think where the numbers, the thresholds should be different, or additional elements that you would recommend. Those are available on our website, and we will be reviewing and considering, and to the extent feasible, incorporating any public feedback over the next couple weeks. And then once that occurs, once we've reviewed all the public feedback that we've had, we will share such with our Service Development Department, and the Equal Opportunities Compliance Programs Office will circle back and review what we've received and to see what we can incorporate, as well as our consultants that are working with us on this program from Foursquare Integrated Transportation Planning. And that group will review everything we received and incorporate any changes that are possible. And then we will present those final policy to MTA's administrator for her review and consideration. And if it receives approval, then that approved policy will be placed on our website so that everyone can see it. And it will become effective with the following service change after that policy is approved. So the timing would depend on how many changes and recommendations come through from the public. If there are lots of feedback that we receive that require us to consider different changes, then that could lengthen out the process for us to review those proposals and to see how we can incorporate that feedback before presenting the final policy to the administrator. But it would not take effect until it's approved by the administrator, and it would not happen until the next service change. So if, for example, there's not much feedback, if everyone says, hey, we like what you're doing, that's making it more encompassing, that more changes are going to be reviewed for equity impacts, then that would go forward to the administrator in a couple of weeks. It would hopefully receive her approval once she reviews it, and then it would take effect with the next service change. And our next planned service change, I believe, and Kyle can correct me if I'm wrong, would be in the winter. Either January or February is when those typically occur.
Yeah, so tentatively, we're looking at whatever that second Sunday. No, I take that back. It's going to be the first Sunday. There was some back and forth about whether it would be the first or second Sunday in February, but it'll be one of those two dates. But I think right now it's leaning towards the first Sunday in February.
Perfect. And I see that LaToya did share a link in the chat, so please do let us know if that worked for you. If it didn't, we can always email a copy of this PDF of the presentation to you, although the PDF of the presentation is on our website. I believe it's been shared.
Yeah, I shared the direct link to the PDF, and then I am sharing now the link to the landing page where that PDF can be found.
Perfect.
But with that, we are at the 11 o'clock hour. I just wanted to give some time before we ended the meeting so that you can get those links. But if there are no further questions, we thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope that you have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you. And I would just share that link that LaToya shared also has information about our Citizens Advisory Committee and the Citizens Advisory Committee for Accessible Transportation, the Mark Riders Advisory Council on it. So if you are interested in those organizations, whether being a part of them or attending their meetings, those links are also on that same link provided by LaToya.
Good.